when there was milk cans, when the milk truck came, there wasn't any tank truck, no pumps.
Hey, good morning. Good morning and good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. We're going to start our Bible class now. And if you'd like to open, we're going to be in Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, talking about conflict and such related things. So if you'd like to open to Philippians chapter 1, we'll be starting in verse 3. Philippians 1 and verse 3 is where we'll start. So we started this Bible class last week, and we looked at verses 1 and 2 and the four principles that verses 1 and 2 give us about what we might call a more mature way to look at our role in the conflict. Kind of the idea, am I the one that's adding to the conflict? It's usually easy to see how the other person is adding to the conflict. It's sometimes harder to see how I'm adding to the conflict. And so in Philippians chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, he gives us four principles that we can draw on to evaluate myself. How is there any way that I'm adding to the conflict? And if so, he gives us the more mature response so that we can help to deal with that. In verses 3 through 7, his emphasis is still throughout the book. He's building toward what we might call really the peak of the book is chapter 4, when he says that he wants Yuri and Sentiki to get along. And so, everything that he says leading up to that is really geared toward these two people and their conflict. Now, of course, there's lots of applications that we can draw in different ways, but that's the focus that he has, is leading up to their conflict, and whatever it's doing to their congregation, apparently it's causing quite a problem. And so he feels the need to write this letter to them to say there's a more mature way for us to handle this. And so in verses 3 through 7, he's going to give us a mature vision of our goal. And another way you can think of that is, how do I see you in my mind? When we are having conflict and I think about you, what is it? What's the way that I see you? How is it that I do think about you? And so he says, starting in verse 3, he says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. And so he's going to lay out some principles here about our goal as people in the big picture, our goal, our kind of day-to-day goal in conflict, and how we see one another.
Now he's specifically talking about those in the church that are having conflict here. Right?
Yes, that's right. These certainly are principles that can apply to anybody that you know. But his emphasis, I would agree, Johnny said, his emphasis is when you have conflict with people in the church, conflict among each other, which certainly does happen sometimes. And so he starts then in verses 3 through 4. And let's see here. He starts in verses 3 through 4. And he says that when we think about one another, we want to incite what we might call that good news feeling. So he says in verse 3, he says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you with all joy. And so he gives us kind of a goal for our thoughts here. The goal for our thoughts is that we want to think of one another and bring up that feeling that you get when you get really good news. If you've ever, the day that your dad brought home your first puppy, or, Christmas morning, or, that really good news feeling that you get, that's what you want to try to strive for when you think about members of the church, especially if you're in conflict with them. You want to overcome the negative feelings that conflict with give you to have that good news feeling. Now let's notice, how does he explain that to us? First of all, he says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. And so the idea here is, he says, when I recall you in my mind, right? Remembrance is a two-part word. It means, on the one hand, I bring you up in my mind. I recall you in my mind. So that's a memory. Right? I drag up the memories of you in my mind. And then the second part of the word is I set my mind on it, or I fix my mind on it. So I remember you and I focus on you. I'm going to spend some time thinking about you. And so if I'm thinking about you, and that's spending time, not just a momentary glance, but I'm going to spend some time thinking about you, my focus is thankfulness. Now, if I'm in conflict with you, That may not be my first instinct to be thankful for you. But if I'm going to spend time thinking about you, it does no good to spend time, muttering under my breath about all the things that you did and how I want to say this to you or that to you. And, it can be easy to kind of let ourselves run away with our thoughts and feelings when we're mad at someone. And he says, don't let yourself spend time ruminating over everything, stewing over your anger. Stop those thoughts. Ephesians 4 says, be angry. It's fine to be angry, and do not sin. If you spend time, stewing and ruminating, you're opening the door to enter into temptation to sin. Instead, he says, spend that time thinking thankful thoughts. Try to, just kind of like with our enemy this morning, we're finding that one good thing. We're looking for the member of the church whom we have conflict with. We're looking for something about them that we can be thankful for. Now, hopefully it's easier to find that than it is a good thought about our memory. Hopefully we can more quickly think of thankful things for each other. But however long it takes, that's what we're focusing on. Yes, ma'am.
The Bible also teaches that we should know that person. So if we have conflict, we're just as strong as maybe that person done or said that we want to address it and let it go.
Yes, we can let it fester. I think that's a good point. She's mentioning Matthew 18, where Jesus says if your brother has something against you, to go to him and try to work it out. And so I think that's certainly a part of this. And what I love about the book of Philippians is, I think when you think about that process that Jesus gives us of going to them to work it out, he's really giving you the thoughts that you have first. Right? And that's, I think sometimes, not that you can ever be too quick to obey Jesus, you certainly can't. But sometimes we think, well, I'm going to go to them because we have conflict, but you go too soon. You haven't thought it through first. You're not ready for that conversation. And you ever done that? You're like, okay, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to walk in. We're going to talk about this like adults. And then you walk in and the first thing you say is something you told yourself you weren't going to say, right? Because you weren't ready for that conversation. Philippians, in fact, the whole book of Philippians is about thought first. What are you thinking about that person or about your situation?
The person you approach, though, also, if not in the frame of mind that you hope they would be,
yes,
it doesn't accept it, and it doesn't go as good as you hope it will.
And that's part of Philippians. We'll talk about, accepting what's out of your control. You get your mind straight. You talk to them the way that Paul tells us to. You can't control how they respond, but at least you know that the conflict, you know that you've been mature. The conflict's not on your side, and you can't help what they do or don't do, but hopefully you're giving them a good example, and with time, maybe they'll come back around to it. And I think you're right about that, and it's easy to walk away from conflict feeling like if it didn't go well, it must be my fault, and maybe it was. That's part of what verses 1 through 2 are about, evaluating, did I contribute to that conflict? But, sometimes you can't just handle things well, and you've got to recognize this is where my boundary ended and where their boundary began. And if I start taking responsibility for what they have to do, I'm never going to feel satisfied with this because I don't have a proper view of who's supposed to be doing what. So I think that's a good point.
Paul wants us also to make sure that we're in the right frame of mind when we go to God for prayer with the help.
Yes. And I think that's yes, he's talking about how he says, I thank my God. And so he talks about this is not just thinking, although that is included, but it's when you think of them, your next step is to pray for them. Now, I do think that the Psalms show us that prayer to God can be some of the most free expression that you have with anybody. And that's, David talks about his enemies, or, sometimes he talks about people whom he thought were friends who then did bad things to him. And he says, I paced the floor when they were sick like they were my own mother. I've done all these things for them, and now they've turned against me. And he's very free with God. His expressions of anger, he's very free with how he feels. But he uses prayer to process those angry feelings and then turn it around to see things how God sees it. And you go read the Psalms, and he almost always turns it around at the end to praise God and to try to see it in a different light. Yes. Yes, he already knows it. And, denying you're angry can only make it worse. And that's, Ephesians 4 says, be angry. There's nothing wrong with being angry. Anger is an emotion, and you can't, manipulate your emotions and make them go away in a moment, right? There's nothing wrong with being angry. The trouble comes is when you allow your anger to take control of you and sin. And that's why it says, be angry and do not sin.
And it turns into hate.
And it can turn into hate. And yes, that's when we looked at The fruit of the Spirit, we talked about how anger can go all the way down to murder through the filter of hatred. Yeah, and so it's important. But the point of Philippians is all this work is mind work. This is all work of thoughts. If you want to have the right conversation with someone, at least on your end, it starts in the mind. And so take a moment, or however long you need, to process and deal with these thoughts. And as Johnny said, to pray to God about it, so that when you go to them, you have your mind filled with things that you are thankful for about them, and not just filled with your angry feelings and things that they've done to hurt you. So as he continues then in verse 4, he says, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you with all joy. And so here, notice he says it twice. It's not obvious in the English translations, but the word for prayer in verse 4 and the word for request are actually the same word. And so twice he mentions this idea of requesting things of God. And notice Paul says, I'm requesting things on your behalf. And that's the focus here is on how we are thinking about what the other person needs. That's going to be an important concept. You think in Philippians 2, he's going to talk about being 2, 1 through 4, talks about thinking of others higher than ourselves, of putting others' needs up on a pedestal a little bit, and really thinking about, well, he says, look out for your own interest, but not just your own interest, also the interest of others in Philippians chapter 2, and I believe verse 4. Yes, verse 4. And so he says, as I think about you, as I'm going over you in my mind, and as I'm praying to God about you, I'm thinking about things I'm thankful for, and I'm thinking about what you need. What are your needs in this conflict? What are not necessarily wants, right? Sometimes people want things that are unrealistic. Legitimate needs that a person has, and how I can help you meet those needs if you're not able to meet them on your own. Any thoughts or comments on that?
What did you say the word request meant?
A request is something that you're asking for, to make a request.
You said another word.
Oh, no. Well, I said that in verse 4, the word for prayer, it says always in every prayer. That word and the word just below it, request, are actually the same word in the original language. And so he's really emphasizing there what we ask God for on your behalf, on the person you have conflict with behalf.
Okay.
And what they need more than anything is for to think of them with that good news feeling. And that's what he says. He says in verse 4, making request for you all with joy. Now, joy is the idea of that feeling you get when you have received good news. That's why, Philippians 4:4, he's going to say, rejoice in the Lord always. How can you always be rejoicing when bad things happen to you? When you're in conflict, how can you be someone who has joy always? Well, it's because you have control of what you think about. And you can choose to always be thinking about things that give you that good news feeling. The emphasis is going to be on the gospel. Gospel is good news. Always thinking about the gospel. And so that's why, as we go through this section, you'll notice he's going to very much tie our thoughts about one another to our work in the gospel, so that when we think of the gospel, we think of each other. And the more that we tie those things together, the more that we build that feeling of receiving good news, whether we're in conflict or not, when we think about one another. Because our strongest tie, the only tie that really matters between me and you, is not whether we like the same sports or whether we watch the same TV shows or listen to the same music or have the same skin color. The bond that matters most between me and you is the fact that we both have a common faith in the gospel, and we're both trying to fulfill that faith. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first and foremost way we should think of one another. And so when we think of the gospel, we think about that until we get that good news feeling, that's joy. And when we think of one another, we do the same thing through the lens of the gospel, so that when I come to you in conflict, what I'm filled with is not my angry, hurt feelings, although they'll still be there. They don't necessarily just go away. But the thing that I've focused on the most is what you do that I'm thankful for, and our connection through the gospel, that good news feeling of joy. Any thoughts or comments on that? Go ahead.
I was just going to say that in the first third of this chapter, really, I guess third, he really is reminding them that they have fellowship
Yes.
with each other.
Yes.
And then with him, and they should be joyful in that.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to lose that fellowship
Right.
with each other or with him or with God even.
Yes.
And so that kind of helps
Yes.
a little bit, and remember that our fellowship with God is based on our fellowship with each other.
That's absolutely right.
Without the other.
Yes, that's absolutely right. He will emphasize throughout the book our fellowship, what we share in common, the work that we share. Fellowship, we tend to think of fellowship as like fellowship meals and potlucks and social time together. But fellowship in the Bible really is more about work that we share in common, the work of the gospel that we share in common. And so when you see fellowship, what he's talking about almost always more than anything, it is a social experience, of course. To work together is a social experience. But what he's talking about more than anything is, that's why he can be in prison. That's where he is right now when he wrote Philippians. He can be in prison and they can be in Philippi, and they're in different cities. They're not having fellowship meals together, but they have fellowship without even being in the same place because they have the same labor and work together. And that's what fellowship is about. And that's something precious. And as Melanie noted, 1 John will tell us that when we lose our fellowship with one another, if we've gone about it in the wrong way, we risk our fellowship with God. It's all tied together. You can't have a fellowship with God and reject fellowship with people that God is in fellowship with. And so if our conflicts, which it always threatens division, then we have to deal with that in a proper way so we don't lose our fellowship with God. Bridget, were you going to?
I was just going to say that sometimes when I have in the past had conflicts with people, especially people that were very close to me.
Sure.
Sometimes I didn't have the words at first.
Yes.
Like to even know what to pray for, and I would be angry. But then as soon as I started, I just started praying blessings on the person.
Sure.
And once the anger and the hatred and everything cleared its way, because you can't be angry at someone that you're blessing.
Yes, that's right.
And so
goes back to your blessing your enemy.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that it just helps to free yourself, and you're able to forgive them, but even before you start knowing what to pray for them for.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, you
I
just
think
ask God for blessings on them.
that's a good point. And that's the thing about emotions like anger is they don't last forever. You will ride the worst of that wave out, and it will start to recede, and it may come back again later, but then it will recede. And so if you can hold on to the fact that I feel angry right now, but if I pray about this, if I think about this the right way, it will recede, and I'll be able to see more clearly, and then I can go talk to that person if I'm ready. That can be useful. Miss Faye? Yes. Yes, it should. Yes, if our hearts are right. But I think the trouble is sometimes our emotions feel too big and we let them take over. And so I think that's the value of Philippians is it should neutralize it, but sometimes we need training and instruction on how to deal with those emotions so that it does neutralize it. But you're absolutely right. That's really what he's getting at.
I was just going to say, Jason Stapleton said one time, when you're not right with man, you're not right with God.
Right, yes.
I was going down 154 speeding, and a cop pulled me over, and I had my head down like this, and I said, my preacher's been trying to tell me that when you're not right with man, you're not right with God. He said, well, ma'am, we're all sinners.
But he's absolutely right. There's definitely, that's why the first and second commandment have to do with loving God and loving your neighbor. It's all tied together. All right, we continue then into verses 5 and 6, where he says, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. So he's telling us now the contents of his prayers. This is what he has been praying for them. He's been praying thankfulness for their fellowship that they share. He says in the gospel. That's his emphasis of fellowship. They're sharing in the work of spreading the gospel. And he says from the first day until now. Now this is what I think is interesting. Let's make sure we're on the right. All right. So this is what I think is interesting is these two verses have an emphasis on looking at time, in particular the whole time that you've known someone and the time in the future that you expect to know someone, which if you're talking about a Christian is forever, right? And that's I think it's helpful sometimes when I feel angry at someone. I try to look at them and think, you are a soul that I want to see in heaven someday. And so it helps to kind of, as Faye said, neutralize a little bit the idea of, this temporary conflict that I'm mad about. When I think about the fact that, someday God is in heaven and we are both hopefully going to be there together. If we have conflict here, it can't go there. There's no conflict there. And so we've got to work this out today to prepare for that. And I want you to be there as much as I want to be there. And so we've got to figure this out. And so there's this time element here. Now, verse 5, he says, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day. That's the day that they believed. Now, Paul is the one who taught them the gospel. That's Acts chapter 16. I think it's 16. And in Acts chapter 16, he goes to the riverside, and there are several Jewish women worshiping there. He teaches them the gospel, and a few of them are baptized, and they join into this relationship with God, and therefore with Paul as a Christian. And one of them, is her name? Man, I'm blanking all of a sudden. Is it Lydia? It is Lydia. Thank you. Yeah, she invites her to her house, and they began the church in Philippi. And then later, he's in prison, and the earthquake happens, and he converts the Philippian jailer. And so here you have at least a segment, the Philippian jailer and Lydia and those women who are members of the church here. And so I think he's pointing back specifically to that moment. Remember when we all together established the church of Christ in Philippi, and you became members of the church. But generally speaking, if you apply it to us today, it's from the first day that you obeyed the gospel until now. You have shared in this labor with other Christians. And so he says, as you think about the past, you want to think about your experiences together. How have the two of you shared in the labor of the gospel? Sometimes there may be very specific things. I have friends that I've gone door knocking with and things like that. Sometimes it may be much more general, just that we've been worshiping together, or that I've heard of them from a different congregation, and I'm just encouraged by the fact that they're faithful there. It just depends on how well you know someone. Maybe it's a new acquaintance in the church and you don't know them well, but just the fact that they have been faithful to God shows that they have been working in a different place as you. And so it's maybe not so much together in a physical sense, but you have been working together in a spiritual sense. And so he says, think about this. When you think about your conflict with them, don't forget all the experiences and all the history that you have, because it's easy to do that, right? It's easy to forget about all of that when you're mad at someone and only think about what you're mad about. It's easy to get wrapped up in this moment and forget your whole history together. He continues and he says from verse 6, he says, being confident of this very thing, that he who begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. I think the emphasis here is try to see their potential for maturity. Who is he who begun a good work? It's God, that's right, yeah. God began a good work in them on the day that they were baptized, the day that they were saved. He began a good work in them. And Paul says, I have confidence. I feel a sense of certain hope that he will complete it. Now, the word for complete is that word that we talk about sometimes that literally just means mature. It means mature. It's when something is finished, it's matured. When your stalks are matured, you can do whatever you do with stalks. I don't know. It's something that's reached its end point. Now, when do we reach our end point of maturity?
When you go to heaven.
When Christ comes back. And 1 Corinthians 15 tells us about that. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 52, says that in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at Christ's return, we will all be changed. And the idea is that as your soul and your body come back together, if you've died, or if you haven't died, as you get lifted up into the sky with Jesus on that last and final day, he then takes you and all of your imperfections, right? Maybe your body isn't working as well as it once did when he lifts you up.
Hallelujah.
He transforms it into a spiritual body that has no more aches and pains and needs surgeries or gets sick or anything like that. And this, but more importantly, more important than your body,
target right there,
is the fact that you have been striving all of your Christian life to be faithful, to be holy, but you've been imperfect. You fail, you sin, and he takes you and he transforms it and makes it complete, perfect, mature, so that you will never be tempted by sin again, and you will never give in to temptation again. Now, that's that day, but that's not this day, right? And so if that's not this day, then we're still tempted, and we still make mistakes, And the person that we're in conflict with may be the most immature baby that you've ever seen today, but try not to base your whole relationship on this moment. Think about all that you've done together before, and think about the fact that someday you want them to be faithful so that they are also lifted up and transformed into complete maturity. And so you can have a mature response to their immaturity, because this is just a moment in their life. Do you want anybody to base your entire reputation of what they know on you on your most immature moment?
No.
We can all think of moments where we did something and we thought, you think about it, that's, my brain tends to do that when I lay down at night and review all the most embarrassing things I've ever done. Like, I need to go to sleep, you have to stop this. You think about a moment and you just want to shrink into a hole. It happened 20 years ago and you still just want to shrink into a hole, and you think, oh, I can't believe I said that or did that. And if someone based their entire thought of you on that moment, it would not be an accurate picture of who you are as a person. Therefore, you can't do that to someone else in this moment just because they're having an immature moment. Should they know better? Absolutely. Should they treat you better than this? Of course they should. Yeah. Is it fair or just or right? No, it's not, but it's a moment. A mature person keeps the big picture in mind and is able to move forward maturely, knowing that none of us are going to reach perfect maturity until Jesus comes back. Yes. That's right. Yes, sometimes it's hardest to be mature with people that you know are more mature than you, because you just expect them. It's like when your kids, yell at you, you're like, well, you're a kid, right? We can deal with this. But when someone who's much older than you lets you down, or someone who has been a Christian longer than you lets you down, then it's harder sometimes because you think, I'm younger, or I know I'm less mature than you. You should be better than this, and then it becomes an excuse to treat them poorly. Anybody can make a mistake at any point in life. Anybody can have an immature moment at any point in life. And so this applies to all people. And we could look at the beginning of 1 Timothy 5 when he talks about rebuking older men as fathers and treating older women as mothers. And even they will have immature moments. We still treat them like fathers and mothers in the faith.
And we don't know what's inside of people and what they're dealing with to bring about that moment.
Yes, and that's, everyone has a past and struggles, and sometimes they just need a little patience to get through it. And that's what we try to give them. And so then, if that's what we do, then the point then is, as we think of the present, of this moment of conflict, which remember, is likely just a moment, just a day, just a season of conflict, we cannot or should strive not to see that person just through this lens of this moment, this conflict. We try to keep the whole thought in mind from the first day that they obey the gospel until the day that Jesus comes back. We know that progress is not linear, right? Getting better and more mature is kind of like this. You have good days and bad days. Maybe they're on one of those bad days. Treat them how you wish people would treat you on your bad days. Yes. Yes. No.
My oldest sister looked at me in March 2020, just before COVID. Her husband literally took an AR in his mouth and blew it out.
Oh, man.
It's her insane way.
Oh, wow.
I went to meet her at my parents' house. She wanted to go to the store with me.
Yeah.
She had all this dealing with in her mind. The clerk said, how is he doing? She couldn't find her.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what?
Sometimes we have automatic responses. Sometimes we need that to get through a moment. Yeah.
And I thought, if she could respond that way,
Right.
like what she had just been through less than 12 hours
Mhm.
recording,
Yeah.
why couldn't we share the same kindness and that?
Yes. Yeah. I think that's, likely she was going through a period of kind of numb shock where, she just wasn't really thinking, she was just responding. And sometimes we just need that, but I do think you're right that, yes. Yeah, and that we can, that's really his point is, it's your thoughts that determine how you respond to people. And so if you are letting yourself think, and I've done this before, I might not even be mad at like my wife or my kids or someone, I'm mad at somebody else, but I've just stewed on it and thought about it, and then my wife says something and I snap at her. I'm not mad at her, but she feels the brunt of it, right? Because I've just been thinking the wrong way and about the wrong thing. It starts with your thoughts. And it starts with especially how you're thinking about the person that you're mad at the person you have conflict with. That's what leads to being able to treat people respectfully and kindly, even when you are going through terrible things, because you just never know what people are going through. So, all right then, so that's about that. Then verse 7, we'll wrap up here with verse 7. And he talks about here making choices with the work that we share together in mind. Verse 7, just as it is right for me. It is right for me, and notice this, to think. This is a really common word in Philippians. It, more than action, it's about the thoughts that lead to action. To think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, and as much as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. And so the goal for our thoughts here is to make our choices about one another with the common work that we share in mind. We are in conflict, perhaps. You know, man, I'm just blanking. Carl, thank you. I was going to say Mr. Allen. Me and Carl are in conflict, say, and it's so easy to let that consume everything. But more than the fact that we share a common belief, we have a work that is higher than our conflict. We have a job as Christians that is more important than whatever feelings or opinions that we have going on. And so he says, think about that.
Why do you think he brought up in chains?
Well, you know, I think that's a good question. He is in chains literally.
Yeah,
he's in prison right now. And I think there's sort of, and he's going to do this more once he gets to chapter 2, starting in verse 12. I think there's this sort of comparison that he's making of, you know, when we're talking about being mature, if anyone has a reason to throw a fit and feel bad about life, it's probably the man who's in prison for doing nothing wrong. And he's saying, you know, even as I am in chains, because, you know, and that's, I think there's a heavy, remember, when he was in Philippi, preaching the gospel to them put him temporarily in prison. And so he's saying, you know, we have shared in some difficult things together, and I've carried the brunt of that. I've gone through more than you. And so if anyone's going to be mad at anyone, maybe it would seem like it'd be me to you. Now, really, that's not fair, but, you know, he's making that point that, you know, an immature person would be. An immature person would blame you for this. So he's using himself sort of as an example of, I can go through all of this and feel this way about you. You can get over whatever, you know, you can work through whatever it is that you're struggling with. So, yes.
I was going to say that there's a cultural difference here, too.
Okay.
When you're talking about prison, because we think of prison today, most of us would say everybody who's in prison is, they're deserving to be there. You know, they deserve to be there.
Could be.
That's not the case back then.
Right.
The Roman Empire put a lot of people in prison for political reasons.
Yes. It was very common.
And so we don't do that here, or we shouldn't.
Right.
I think it's something
It's less common, yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
But generally, people in prison here in the United States, they're there because
They've done something wrong most of the time. Yeah.
That's not the case here.
Right.
Back in the Roman Empire, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were put in prison for not doing anything other than just being on the wrong list.
Right. Yes. And so, you know, he's innocent. I think that does play in with it. So as we're looking at this, then he says, you know, first of all, I'm going to, again, choose my thoughts. I'm going to choose what I think about you. He says, it is right for me to think. Now, the word for think there, it's a word, you know the word to curb something. I'm going to curb my diet, so, you know, I curb my appetite. To curb something back. Yeah, it's to curb something. I'm sorry. Oh, just one moment then. To curb something, and then it's David. We're ignoring David. No. To curb something, and then it says literally the gut, but it's the idea of the mind. You know, you feel things especially when you're really upset. You feel things down in the pit of your stomach, and he's saying, curb the gut. You know, to curb those thoughts, to choose what it is that you're thinking about. What you think about dictates your emotions and therefore your actions. Yes. Sorry, David.
Very seldom, but I was just thinking, you know, I've never really accomplished anything being angry. I couldn't accomplish better if I had it to the mind.
That's right.
And the other thing I was thinking was, everybody's like financial statements. You have assets and you have liabilities.
Yes.
You hope your assets are higher than your liabilities. So
Right.
you have enough.
Yeah, and that's, you know, certainly our liabilities as far as God's concerned will always outweigh our assets, but we're trying to do the best we can in this life. And I like what you said, you know, I never accomplished anything good angry that I couldn't have done better with a clear mind. Anger is a scary emotion because it makes you feel more confident. And some people like being angry because it's the only time they feel sure of themselves. anger kind of makes you feel like you know what's best. But always when the anger fades away, you realize that you were not acting in a sober way. And so I think that's a really good thought to remember. When you feel angry, I feel like I know just what that person needs. I'm going to feel differently when I calm down. This anger will pass, but what I do in this anger will not go away. I have to deal with that. So, yes. That's right. Yeah.
If I'm doing certain jobs and I struggle with it and I get angry, it gives me more strength and I can just toss that bale of hay right on where it's supposed to be.
Yes. That's right. Yeah, but only if it's under control.
Anger control can do a lot for you.
It can do a lot for you. But once you let it go and it controls you, that's when it becomes a problem. Yes. Especially when we're angry. Yep.
Because I knew they did this, and this. I was so wrong, it was unreal. I mean, completely 180 every way.
Yes.
Which just happens seldom, but it happens a lot.
Me too.
We think somebody did something because they're mean, and particularly just because they're dumb.
Right. Could be. There's lots of reasons, Mr. Clay, lots of reasons.
Didn't know what they were saying.
Yeah, in anger,
They probably done the same thing.
I think that's exactly it. In anger, you really feel sure you know what's going on, and that's not always the case. So we choose what we think about. He follows that with the idea that we choose our actions. He says in verse 7, because I have you in my heart. Now remember, the heart in the Jewish mind is not the seat of emotions, although there is some tie-in. The heart is the seat of decision making. The heart is the process that you go through to make the decisions of what you're going to do. And so he says, I have you in my heart. When I make decisions, you are there in my mind, informing those decisions. I don't make decisions rashly. I make them because I've chosen. It's right. He says, it's right for me to think this way about you and to make decisions with you in mind because, he says, inasmuch as both in my chains and in a defense and confirmation, and so he's in prison and he says that's a way that I'm defending the gospel and I'm stabilizing or confirming to people around me that the gospel is true. But notice the emphasis of the gospel. It's still about the work that they share in Jesus Christ. You all are partakers with me of grace. Now they are not in prison, and they are not there with him. They are not suffering the same way that he has suffered. But he says, the favor that God gives me because I'm doing this, the grace that God applies to me because I've chosen to walk in his ways and suffer in this way, you share that with me because you have aided me, because you helped me, because we're working together. And so there's no conflict we can't overcome when we remember that we have a higher work that we are both a part of. And so our ultimate goal then, someday we all want to be completely mature, transformed, and completed by Jesus Christ. But our day-to-day goal when we face conflict is just to respond maturely in conflict, knowing the other person may just be having a bad moment. Now back from verses 1 through 2, it's good to kind of look at yourself and say, maybe I'm contributing to the conflict. But if you determine that you're not contributing to the conflict, this is not on you, it really is them being immature, and you've done everything to the best of your ability to not, add to the conflict, and it just still persists. He says, still respond with maturity, because this is just a blip in their life. You don't want to turn into something bigger than it actually is. Any last thoughts or comments this morning?
Just so I want to read something here, because we know that if you do not resolve the conflict, it will eventually drive you apart.
Yes, and we've seen that happen.
Eventually drive somebody away. In Hebrews, in chapter 6, this is one of the things the Hebrew writer says. For it is impossible for those who were once enlightened to have tasted the heavenly gift and to become partakers of the Holy Spirit and have tasted the good word of God and the powers of the ages to come, if they fall away, to renew them again to repentance, since they crucify again themselves, the Son of God, and put him in the open shame.
Yeah, so,
because that's what it can lead to, and that's what we never, ever want to get to.
Right. Sometimes you see people not handle their conflict well, and you see Christians split as far as one might just go to a different church, and they'll remain faithful, and that's a heartbreaking, terrible thing. You never want to see that. They need to figure out how to work it out, but they'll just go. But sometimes you see Christians who just fall away completely, and because of the conflict that you have with them, they are no longer faithful to God. Now, that can't all be on you. They made their own choice, and that's what we say. Be careful not to put your faith in the church, because as good as the church is, sometimes it will let you down. Your faith has to be in God, but all the same, you don't want to contribute. Jesus said not to put a stumbling block in front of these little ones, because it would be better for them to never have known than, for them to
Have known and gone away from it.
yes, that he uses the image of tying a millstone around your neck and being pulled down in the bottom of the ocean and drowning. That's better than causing someone to stumble. And so if our conflict causes someone to stumble and fall away from Christ, he takes that very seriously, and we need to do something about that. That's why it's so important to deal with conflict early and to try to be mature as quick as we can. Maybe we've messed it up already, but we can mature and get better at dealing with it today in this particular conflict, so that we don't lead to things that we can't take back and that they won't fix. So that's
When you're in
very
that
important.
Family that has not seen that happen in our earthly family.
Sure, yeah.
The families have totally fallen apart, won't even talk to each other
Won't talk to each
till
other.
death. I
And
know
it's heartbreaking.
brothers
It's
and
heartbreaking.
sisters that went to their graves hating each other.
Yes.
Just had this past week. One of my stepmoms, her and her brother, I never met him because they hated each other, and they both have died now. Went to their graves hating each other.
Hating each other. It shouldn't be that way with family, but it especially shouldn't
And
be.
this is our church family.
Yes.
It's even more important
That's
than
right.
our earthly family.
That's what God says. The spiritual family is more important. It's even more important that we work out our conflict. And so that's why we have Philippians to help us do that. All right. Any last thoughts or comments? Yes, ma'am.
If you're have your mind in an angry mood, you're not gonna be thinking about how that's gonna affect or what
That's right.
you're on down the road.
No, you lose sight of the big picture. That's what anger does. It makes everything about now and how you feel. I'm sorry? And me. It does. Anger makes everything about me, and it makes everything about now. You completely lose sight of them and about the big picture. And I think that's a large part when we look at a mature vision of our goals. We're trying not to lose sight of what really matters, the big picture in every possible way. So I think those are very astute responses.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we will wrap it up there and pick up next week with the next section. We'll be looking at Philippians 8 through 11, Philippians 1, 8 through 11. And there were flyers out there, or an outline of Philippians with the dates. And so if you need one of those, and they're not out there, let me know, I can print some more. But if you'd like to know where we're going over this class and when we're going to be there, you can have one of those, and it'll keep you on track. Help you know what to read before class if you like to.
And if
So,
you're,
all right.
if you
Thank
hear
you so much,
gossip,
and y'all have
but
a
know
good
it's
afternoon. We'll
gossip,
see you
believe
tonight.
none of what you hear and half of what you see.
And that's what Dale says about